Excuse me, but you are absolutely in the wrong seat, and I need you to move immediately before I call security on you." The words sliced through the hushed luxury of the first-class cabin, like a blade causing every passenger within earshot to freeze mid-motion. Dr. Isaiah Washington looked up from his medical journal, his dark eyes meeting the furious gaze of a platinum-blonde woman who was standing over him like a storm cloud ready to burst. The morning sun streaming through the aircraft windows caught the diamonds glittering on her manicured fingers as she pointed accusingly at his seat. At 53, Isaiah had encountered this particular brand of hostility more times than he cared to remember, but it still had the power to make his chest tighten with a familiar mixture of weariness and disappointment. He was dressed simply in a navy blue sweater, comfortable jeans, and well-worn leather shoes, carrying nothing more than a medical bag and a paperback novel, yet something about his presence in seat 2B seemed to offend this woman to her very core. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had specifically chosen to dress down for this flight, hoping to avoid exactly this kind of attention during what was supposed to be a quiet journey to see his daughter graduate from medical school. "Ma'am, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Isaiah said quietly, his voice carrying the measured calm that came from years of diffusing tense situations in operating rooms and military briefings. "I have my boarding pass right here if you'd like to see it, and I'm quite certain this is my assigned seat." He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, movements deliberate and non-threatening, knowing that any sudden gesture might escalate an already volatile situation. The woman who had introduced herself loudly to the flight attendant moments earlier as Vivian Blackwood took a step back as if his mere movement posed some kind of threat. Her platinum hair was styled in a razor-sharp bob that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her tailored Chanel suit screamed old money and older prejudices. The scent of her expensive perfume mingled with the recycled air, creating an almost suffocating cloud of entitlement that seemed to follow her wherever she went. "Don't you dare reach for anything," Vivian hissed, her voice rising to a pitch that caused several other passengers to look up from their phones and newspapers. "Sarah, get over here right now and deal with this situation before it gets completely out of hand." She snapped her fingers imperiously at the flight attendant, a young woman with tired eyes who was trying to serve champagne to the other first-class passengers, while clearly hoping to avoid getting dragged into whatever drama was unfolding in row 2. Sarah approached with obvious reluctance, her smile strained and her movements careful as she navigated between the two passengers. She had been working for Global Atlantic Airlines for 3 years, and she had seen her fair share of entitled passengers, but something about the tension crackling between these two made her stomach knot with anxiety. "Is everything all right here? Miss Blackwood? Sir, is there anything I can help you with?" "Everything is most certainly not all right," Vivian declared, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested she was accustomed to having her every word treated as gospel. "This man is sitting in the wrong seat, and when I politely asked him to move, he became aggressive and started reaching into his jacket in a threatening manner. I paid $12,000 for this ticket, and I absolutely refuse to sit next to someone who clearly doesn't belong in first class." Isaiah felt the familiar weight of injustice settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket, but he kept his expression neutral and his hands visible on the armrests of his seat. He had learned long ago that defending himself too vigorously in situations like this often only made things worse, and he could see the fear flickering in the flight attendant's eyes as she tried to process the accusation. "I haven't been aggressive with anyone," he said calmly, "and I was simply reaching for my boarding pass to show that I'm in the correct seat." "Let me see your ticket," Sarah said, though her tone suggested she was already inclined to believe the well-dressed white woman over the casually dressed black man, regardless of what the actual facts might be. It was a dynamic Isaiah had witnessed countless times throughout his life, and he found himself wondering not for the first time whether his decision to keep his military rank and position private during personal travel was worth the hassle it sometimes created. As Isaiah handed over his boarding pass, he noticed that several other passengers were now openly watching the confrontation, some with expressions of curiosity, others with obvious discomfort. A young woman in seat 4A was discreetly holding her phone in a way that suggested she might be recording the incident, and Isaiah felt a pang of concern about how this moment might be interpreted if it ended up on social media. The last thing he needed was to become the subject of a viral video, especially given his current position and the sensitive nature of his work. Vivian snatched the boarding pass from Sarah's hands before the flight attendant could properly examine it, her eyes scanning the information with the intensity of a prosecutor examining evidence. Her face fell slightly as she read the details, but instead of backing down, she seemed to double down on her conviction that something wasn't right. "This has to be fake," she announced loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "There's no way this man could afford a first-class ticket on his own, so either he's using stolen miles, or he's some kind of employee deadheading on a buddy pass, or this boarding pass is completely fraudulent." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, and Isaiah felt something cold and hard settle in his chest as he realized that this woman was determined to humiliate him regardless of what evidence might contradict her assumptions. He had spent decades serving his country with honor, had saved countless lives in military hospitals around the world, and had earned every stripe and star on his dress uniform through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Yet none of that mattered to someone who had already decided what she was seeing, based purely on the color of his skin and the casual nature of his clothing. "Ma'am, I can assure you that my ticket is legitimate," Isaiah said, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. "I purchased it with my own money, and I have every right to be sitting in this seat. Perhaps we could ask the captain to resolve this matter if you're not satisfied with the documentation I've provided." Vivian's eyes flashed with what looked like panic at the mention of involving higher authority, and Isaiah wondered briefly if there was more to her aggressive behavior than simple prejudice. He had seen enough people in crisis during his medical and military career to recognize the signs of someone who was operating from a place of fear rather than genuine anger. But that recognition didn't make her treatment of him any less unacceptable or any easier to endure with grace. The tension in the cabin was now thick enough to cut with a knife, and Sarah looked like she wanted nothing more than to disappear into the galley and pretend this entire situation wasn't happening. But as the minutes ticked by and more passengers began to take notice of the confrontation, it became increasingly clear that this was not going to be resolved quickly or quietly, and that someone was going to have to make a decision about how to handle a situation that seemed to be spiraling further out of control with each passing moment. Vivian Blackwood had not always been the kind of woman who demanded immediate compliance from flight attendants and assumed the worst about fellow passengers based on their appearance. There had been a time decades ago when she had been Vivian Mueller, the daughter of a factory worker in Detroit who had scraped together enough money for community college by working double shifts at a diner and dreaming of something bigger than the cramped apartment she shared with her mother and 3 younger siblings. That version of herself felt like a stranger now buried beneath layers of wealth and status that had accumulated like sediment over the 30 years since she had married pharmaceutical mogul Richard Blackwood in what had been described by society columnists as the wedding of the century. Richard had been 20 years her senior, brilliant, driven, and utterly smitten with the ambitious young woman who had talked her way into a job at his company despite having no connections and limited experience in the corporate world. Those early years of their marriage had been a whirlwind of social climbing and empire building as Richard expanded Blackwood Pharmaceuticals from a regional supplier into a global powerhouse that held contracts with military bases, hospitals, and medical facilities around the world. Vivian had transformed herself into the perfect corporate wife, learning to navigate charity galas and board meetings with equal skill, gradually forgetting the girl who had once counted pennies for bus fare and dreamed of becoming a nurse. The money had come in torrents after Richard's company secured its first major military medical contract, providing everything from bandages and antibiotics to complex surgical equipment for overseas operations. Vivian had reveled in the security that wealth provided, buying homes in 3 different countries, collecting art and jewelry, and establishing herself as a fixture in the highest echelons of society. But beneath the glittering surface, she had always carried a gnawing fear that it could all disappear as quickly as it had arrived. That fear had metastasized into something darker after Richard's sudden death from a heart attack 5 years ago, leaving her to navigate the complex world of pharmaceutical manufacturing and military contracts without his steady hand to guide her. The company's board of directors had made it clear that they tolerated her leadership only because she controlled the majority of shares, and she had spent every day since the funeral feeling like she was walking a tightrope over an abyss, knowing that one wrong move could send everything crashing down. Recent months had been particularly challenging as several military medical contracts had come under scrutiny for quality control issues that Vivian didn't fully understand but knew could be catastrophic for the company's reputation and bottom line. The board meetings had become increasingly tense affairs where complex medical terms were thrown around like weapons, and she often felt like she was drowning in jargon and bureaucracy while trying to maintain the facade that she was in complete control. The stress had begun to manifest in ways that frightened her, from sleepless nights spent poring over financial reports she couldn't quite decipher to increasingly frequent outbursts at employees who failed to meet her impossible standards. She had fired 3 different public relations firms in the past year alone, convinced that none of them understood the gravity of what they were dealing with or the importance of maintaining Blackwood Pharmaceutical's sterling reputation in the face of mounting criticism. This morning's flight to London was supposed to be the beginning of a crucial business trip to meet with European distributors who were threatening to cancel their contracts unless quality issues were resolved immediately. Vivian had spent weeks preparing for these meetings, studying technical reports and memorizing talking points that she hoped would convince their partners that Blackwood Pharmaceuticals was still the reliable supplier they had trusted for decades. But the moment she had seen Isaiah Washington sitting calmly in what she considered her domain, reading what appeared to be some kind of medical journal with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged there, something primal and ugly had awakened in her chest. In her current state of heightened anxiety and paranoia, his presence had felt like a threat, a reminder that she was surrounded by people who might have more legitimate expertise than she possessed. Meanwhile, 3 rows behind her, Isaiah was trying to focus on a research paper about combat trauma treatment while processing the familiar sting of being judged and found wanting by someone who had never bothered to look beyond the surface. At 53, he had long ago stopped being surprised by these encounters, but that didn't make them any less exhausting or any less damaging to witness, especially when other people were watching and drawing their own conclusions about what they were seeing. His phone buzzed softly with an incoming video call, and he smiled despite the tension when he saw his daughter Maya's face appear on the screen, her medical school graduation cap slightly askew, and her grin infectious even through the small display. At 26, she had inherited her father's calm determination and her mother's fierce intelligence, and she was exactly 1 week away from receiving her medical degree from Johns Hopkins, a moment that Isaiah had been anticipating for months. "Dad, are you somewhere you can talk?" Maya asked, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I just got the final results from my boards, and I wanted to share the news with you before the ceremony next weekend." She was calling from her apartment near the medical school, surrounded by the controlled chaos of moving boxes and study materials that had defined her life for the past 4 years. "Of course," sweetheart Isaiah said, lowering his voice and angling the phone away from the increasingly agitated woman across the aisle. "I'm on the plane to London for that conference, but I have a few minutes before we take off. Tell me everything." He had been looking forward to this call all morning, knowing that Maya had been anxiously waiting for her final scores, and that this conversation would likely be one of the highlights of his entire week. "I passed everything with honors." "Dad," Maya said, her voice catching slightly with emotion. "I'm going to be Dr. Maya Washington in exactly 7 days, and I still can't quite believe it's real. Thank you for believing in me, even when I wasn't sure I could do it, and thank you for showing me what it means to serve something bigger than yourself." She paused, wiping away tears that she hadn't expected to shed during what was supposed to be a quick check-in call. Isaiah felt his own throat tighten with pride and love, momentarily forgetting about the hostile woman across the aisle and the uncomfortable tension that had been building in the cabin around him. This was what mattered, he reminded himself, not the small-minded prejudices of strangers who would never take the time to see him as anything more than their own assumptions and fears. "I'm so proud of you, Maya," he said softly. "Your mother would be absolutely thrilled to see the incredible woman and doctor you've become, and I can't wait to be there next week to watch you walk across that stage and officially join the ranks of people who have dedicated their lives to healing others." He glanced up and noticed that Vivian was staring at him with undisguised suspicion, apparently offended by his quiet conversation with his daughter. As he ended the call and put his phone away, Isaiah couldn't help but reflect on the irony of his current situation, sitting in a luxurious airplane seat while being treated like a potential criminal by someone who had no idea that he spent his days making decisions that affected the health and safety of military personnel around the world. The arrival of the Port Authority police officers 20 minutes later transformed what had been an uncomfortable standoff into something that felt distinctly more dangerous and potentially life-altering for everyone involved. Vivian had spent the intervening time making increasingly frantic phone calls to various contacts, each conversation growing more heated as she demanded immediate action from people who seemed reluctant to get involved in what sounded like a personal dispute on an airplane. Officer Martinez was the first aboard, followed closely by his partner, Officer Chen, both of them wearing the grim expressions of men who had been called away from more pressing duties to deal with what their dispatcher had described as a disturbance involving a suspicious passenger in first class. They had been working airport security for a combined 15 years, and they had seen every possible variation of passenger conflict, from drunk celebrities to nervous flyers having panic attacks. "Who made the complaint?" Martinez asked, scanning the cabin with practiced eyes that took in the expensive leather seats, the nervous flight attendant hovering near the galley, and the obvious tension crackling between the platinum-blonde woman standing in the aisle and the black man sitting calmly in seat 2B with his hands folded in his lap. "I did," Vivian announced, rushing toward the officers with the kind of urgency typically reserved for reporting active crimes in progress. "That man has been aggressive and threatening toward me, and I have serious concerns about his intentions on this flight. He's in a seat that I don't believe he has any right to occupy, and when I asked him politely to clarify the situation, he became hostile and started making threatening gestures." Martinez looked at Isaiah, who remained seated with the same quiet composure he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, showing no signs of the aggressive behavior that had been described to them. His partner Chen was already pulling out a notebook, preparing to document what appeared to be a routine passenger dispute that would likely be resolved with some basic fact-checking and perhaps a seat reassignment. "Sir, could you tell me your side of what happened here?" Martinez asked, his tone professional, but not accusatory, as he approached Isaiah's seat. He had learned over the years that the truth in these situations was usually somewhere in the middle, and that people's perceptions of events could be dramatically different depending on their perspective and emotional state. Certainly, Officer Isaiah replied, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had served him well in countless briefings and crisis situations. "I boarded the aircraft with a valid first-class ticket, took my assigned seat, and began reading while waiting for departure. This lady approached me and demanded that I move, claiming I was in the wrong seat. When I offered to show her my boarding pass to clarify the situation, she became upset and accused me of making threatening gestures." "He's lying," Vivian interjected. Before Martinez could respond, her voice rising to a pitch that caused several other passengers to turn and stare openly at the unfolding drama. "He was absolutely aggressive and intimidating, and I felt genuinely afraid for my safety." "Look at him. Officer, really look at him and tell me he belongs in first class on this aircraft." The racist implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Martinez felt his jaw tighten as he processed what he was hearing. In all his years of dealing with passenger disputes, he had encountered every possible combination of entitlement and prejudice. But something about this woman's barely concealed racism and the dignified way the accused man was handling the situation made him deeply uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I need you to be very specific about what threatening behavior you witnessed," Chen said, stepping forward to take control of the questioning. "Did this gentleman make any verbal threats toward you? Did he make any physical gestures that could be interpreted as intimidating? Did he attempt to touch you or invade your personal space in any way?" Vivian faltered for a moment, realizing that her accusations were beginning to sound increasingly thin under professional scrutiny. She had been operating on pure emotion and instinct driven by fear and prejudice rather than any actual evidence of wrongdoing, and the officer's calm questions were forcing her to confront the weakness of her position. He reached into his jacket in a threatening manner, she said, finally grasping for something concrete to support her claims. "And when I told him he was in the wrong seat, he became defiant and argumentative, instead of simply moving to where he belonged. The whole interaction felt menacing and inappropriate." Isaiah remained perfectly still, knowing that any movement or expression of frustration at this point could be misinterpreted or used against him in ways that might escalate an already precarious situation. He had seen too many encounters like this go sideways because someone had allowed emotion to override careful judgment, and he was determined not to give anyone an excuse to treat him as anything other than the law-abiding citizen he was. "Sir, what were you reaching for when the complainant says she felt threatened?" Martinez asked, though his tone suggested he was going through the motions rather than expecting to uncover evidence of any actual threat. "My boarding pass," Isaiah replied simply. "She had demanded to see proof that I belonged in this seat, and I was attempting to provide exactly what she had asked for when she accused me of threatening behavior. The boarding pass is still in my jacket pocket if you'd like to examine it." Chen nodded and gestured for Isaiah to slowly remove the document, which he did with deliberate care, keeping his movements visible and non-threatening throughout the process. The boarding pass clearly showed his name, seat assignment, and first-class status, completely contradicting Vivian's claims about his legitimacy as a passenger. "This appears to be a valid ticket for seat 2B. Chen announced, examining the boarding pass carefully before handing it back to Isaiah. "Sir, is there anything else you'd like to add about this incident? Any other details that might help us understand what happened here? Only that I hope we can resolve this quickly and allow everyone to continue with their travel plans," Isaiah said diplomatically, though something in his tone suggested that he was rapidly losing patience with the entire situation. "I understand that air travel can be stressful and sometimes misunderstandings occur, but I would appreciate the opportunity to simply read my book and prepare for my meetings in London." Vivian felt panic beginning to claw at her chest as she realized that the officers were not taking her accusations seriously, and that her attempt to have Isaiah removed from the flight was backfiring spectacularly. The other passengers were now openly staring at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disgust, and she could see at least 2 people holding their phones in ways that suggested they might be recording the encounter. "Officers, I demand that you check his identification more thoroughly," she said desperately, her voice cracking with strain. "I have a feeling that if you run his name through your databases, you'll find that he has a criminal record or outstanding warrants or something that explains why he's behaving so suspiciously. People don't just act this way without reason." Martinez exchanged a look with his partner, both of them recognizing the escalating desperation of someone whose accusations were falling apart under scrutiny. They had seen this pattern countless times before, usually involving people who had made assumptions based on prejudice, and then doubled down rather than admit they had been wrong. "Ma'am, we don't have probable cause to run background checks on passengers who haven't committed any crimes," Chen explained patiently. "This gentleman has a valid ticket. He's been cooperative throughout our questioning, and we haven't observed any threatening behavior. At this point, we recommend that you take your seat and allow the flight to proceed as scheduled." The suggestion that she should back down and accept defeat sent Vivian into a state of near panic, and she felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her as she realized that her usual methods of controlling situations through wealth and social status were completely ineffective in this environment. "I want to speak to your supervisor," she demanded, her voice rising to a near shriek. "And I want to speak to the captain of this aircraft immediately. I am not going to be dismissed and ignored when I have legitimate safety concerns about a passenger who is clearly not what he appears to be." The mention of speaking to the captain caused a flicker of something that might have been amusement to cross Isaiah's face, though he quickly suppressed it and returned to his neutral expression. He had a feeling that Vivian Blackwood was about to get exactly what she was asking for, though probably not in the way she expected or hoped. Captain Elena Martinez emerged from the cockpit with the measured stride of someone who had spent 30 years navigating everything from emergency landings to unruly passengers, her 4 gold stripes catching the overhead lights as she approached the cluster of people gathered around row 2. She was a small woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and eyes that had seen enough in 3 decades of flying to rarely be surprised by human behavior. But the radio call from her crew about a situation involving potential VIP passenger recognition had piqued her curiosity. Behind her walked First Officer James Park, a younger man who carried himself with the crisp professionalism of someone still eager to prove himself worthy of the captain's confidence. Park had been the one to initially suggest that they might want to personally assess the situation after Sarah had mentioned certain details that seemed inconsistent with a typical passenger dispute. "I understand we have a disagreement about seating arrangements," Captain Martinez said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from years of making life-or-death decisions at 40,000 feet. She had dealt with everything from celebrities demanding special treatment to passengers having medical emergencies, and she approached each situation with the same methodical professionalism that had earned her reputation as one of the airline's most respected pilots. Vivian immediately seized on the captain's arrival as validation of her position and proof that her concerns were being taken seriously by the highest levels of authority on the aircraft. "Captain, thank goodness you're here," she said, rushing toward the uniformed woman with obvious relief. "I've been trying to explain to these officers that we have a serious security situation, and I need you to remove this passenger immediately before something terrible happens." "What kind of security situation are you referring to?" Miss Captain Martinez asked, though her eyes had already shifted to Isaiah, who remained seated with the same quiet composure he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Something about his posture and bearing triggered a flash of recognition that made her pause and look more carefully at his face, trying to place where she might have seen him before. "This man is clearly not who he pretends to be." Vivian continued gesturing dramatically toward Isaiah, as if his mere presence constituted evidence of wrongdoing. "He's sitting in first class wearing casual clothes. He became aggressive when I questioned his right to be there, and I strongly suspect that his boarding pass is fraudulent or that he's using stolen miles or employee benefits to access accommodations he hasn't legitimately purchased." Captain Martinez studied Isaiah's face more intently, noting the calm intelligence in his dark eyes and the way he carried himself with unconscious military bearing despite his civilian clothes. There was something familiar about his features, something that tugged at her memory from official briefings and formal military ceremonies she had attended as part of her reserve duties with the Air National Guard. "Sir, would you mind if I took a look at your identification?" Captain Martinez asked, her tone respectful rather than suspicious as she approached Isaiah's seat. She had learned over the years that there was often much more to passenger conflicts than appeared on the surface, and something about this particular situation was setting off alarm bells in her head that had nothing to do with security concerns. Of course, Captain Isaiah replied, reaching slowly into his jacket to retrieve his wallet. As he handed over his military identification card rather than a standard driver's license, Captain Martinez felt her breath catch in her throat as she recognized the distinctive formatting and security features that marked it as belonging to someone with significant clearance and authority within the defense establishment. The identification card bore the name Dr. Isaiah Washington, along with a photograph that clearly matched the man sitting in seat 2B, but it was the rank and position information that caused Captain Martinez to straighten unconsciously and adopt a more formal posture. The card identified its holder as a brigadier general in the United States Army Medical Corps and listed his current position as Chief Medical Officer for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a role that placed him among the highest-ranking medical professionals in the entire military establishment. General Washington Captain Martinez said, her voice dropping to a respectful whisper as she handed the identification back with both hands. "I apologize for this disruption, sir. We had no idea you were traveling with us today." She felt a flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck as she realized that one of the most senior medical officers in the United States military had been subjected to harassment and false accusations while under her authority as captain of the aircraft. The words General Washington seemed to hit Vivian like a physical blow, and she stumbled backward as if she had been struck by lightning. Her mind struggled to process what she was hearing, trying to reconcile the image of the casually dressed black man sitting quietly in seat 2B with the reality of his actual rank and position within the military hierarchy. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the aircraft's ventilation system. "He's wearing jeans and sneakers. He doesn't look like a general. Generals wear uniforms with medals and ribbons. They don't dress like ordinary people." Isaiah finally allowed himself a small smile as he watched the woman who had spent the better part of an hour questioning his right to exist in her proximity struggle to accept evidence that completely contradicted her assumptions about who deserved respect and recognition. "Miss Blackwood." "I believe," he said, his tone remaining calm, but taking on a slight edge that suggested his patience was not unlimited. "I don't typically travel in uniform unless I'm on official business, and today I'm simply a father flying to London to attend his daughter's medical school graduation." Officer Martinez, who had been watching the entire exchange with growing amazement, stepped forward to address the captain. "Ma'am, we were called to investigate reports of threatening behavior, but based on our interviews and observations, there's no evidence that General Washington has done anything inappropriate or concerning. The complainant appears to have made assumptions based on appearance rather than actual behavior." "I understand completely," Captain Martinez replied, though her tone suggested that her understanding extended far beyond the immediate situation to encompass the broader implications of what had just occurred on her aircraft. She turned to address Vivian directly, her expression hardening as she processed the full scope of what had taken place under her watch. "Miss Blackwood, you have just spent the better part of an hour making false accusations against one of the most senior medical officers in the United States military," Captain Martinez said, her voice carrying a weight that made it clear this was no longer a routine passenger dispute. "General Washington oversees medical care for military personnel around the world, and he has dedicated his entire career to serving this country with honor and distinction." Vivian felt the blood draining from her face as the full implications of her actions began to sink in, and she realized that she had not only embarrassed herself publicly, but had also potentially created a diplomatic incident involving someone with significant influence within the defense establishment. Her mind raced frantically as she tried to think of some way to minimize the damage or excuse her behavior, but every potential explanation sounded hollow and inadequate, even in her own head. "I didn't know," she stammered, her voice cracking with strain. "How was I supposed to know he wasn't in uniform? He wasn't wearing any insignia, and he was just sitting there like any other passenger. If he's really a general, why doesn't he identify himself properly so that people can show him the respect he deserves?" Isaiah leaned back in his seat, studying Vivian's face with the clinical detachment of someone who had spent decades observing human behavior under stress. "Miss Blackwood, "The respect I deserve isn't based on my rank or my uniform," he said quietly. "It's based on the simple fact that I'm a human being, just like every other person on this aircraft. The same respect I would have deserved if I had been a teacher or a construction worker or someone flying home to visit family." The rebuke was gentle, but devastating, and Vivian felt tears beginning to blur her vision as she realized that there was no way to undo the damage she had caused or to take back the assumptions and accusations that had revealed so much about her character and values. She looked around the cabin at the other passengers, all of whom were now staring at her with expressions ranging from disgust to pity, and she understood that this moment would likely define how she was perceived for years to come. Captain Martinez addressed the officers who had responded to the initial complaint, her tone brisk and professional as she sought to bring the situation to a close. "Officers, I believe this matter has been resolved. General Washington will be continuing his journey with us, and I want to ensure that he receives every courtesy and consideration for the remainder of the flight." "Understood," Captain Officer Chen replied, closing his notebook and preparing to leave the aircraft. "General, we apologize for any inconvenience this situation may have caused. Thank you for your service, sir." He offered a respectful nod before turning to follow his partner back toward the exit, leaving behind a cabin full of passengers who were still processing what they had just witnessed. As the officers departed, Captain Martinez turned her attention back to Vivian, who was standing in the aisle, looking like someone who had just watched her entire world collapse around her. "Miss Blackwood, I need you to take your seat immediately and refrain from any further interaction with General Washington or any other passengers for the duration of this flight. Any additional disruptions will result in your removal from the aircraft and potential federal charges for interfering with flight operations." The threat of removal and federal charges sent a jolt of terror through Vivian's already overwhelmed nervous system, and she nodded frantically as she stumbled toward her assigned seat. She collapsed into the leather chair that had seemed like such a symbol of her status and privilege just an hour earlier, but which now felt more like a prison where she would be forced to sit with the consequences of her actions for the next several hours. Isaiah watched her retreat with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, knowing that justice had been served, but taking no particular pleasure in watching another human being confront the ugly realities of their own prejudices. He had seen this pattern too many times before, the moment when people realized that their assumptions about the world were not only wrong, but potentially destructive to themselves and others. Claire Dubois, the fashion influencer seated in 4A, had been discreetly recording the entire confrontation on her phone from the moment Vivian had first raised her voice at Isaiah. As a social media professional with over 2 million followers across various platforms, Claire had developed an instinct for recognizing content that would resonate with audiences, and the dramatic reversal she had just witnessed was exactly the kind of real-world karma that her followers craved. The moment Captain Martinez had revealed Isaiah's true identity as General Washington, Claire knew she was sitting on content that would likely break the internet within hours of being posted. She had captured everything from Vivian's initial racist accusations to the officer's investigation, to the stunning revelation that had left the entitled woman speechless and humiliated in front of a cabin full of witnesses. "This is absolutely unbelievable," Claire whispered to her phone camera as she switched to her front-facing camera to provide commentary on what she had just recorded. "I have just witnessed the most insane example of instant karma that I have ever seen in my entire life, and I literally have it all on video. A woman just spent an hour trying to get a black man kicked off this flight because she didn't think he belonged in first class, and it turns out he's a freaking general in the United States Army." She quickly edited the footage into a concise 3-minute video that captured all the key moments of the confrontation, adding captions that identified the key players, and provided context for viewers who might not immediately understand the significance of what they were watching. Claire had built her following by having an eye for content that would generate strong emotional responses, and she knew that this video had all the elements necessary to go viral within hours. The caption she wrote for the video was designed to maximize engagement and shares. "Racist Karen, tries to kick Army General off flight. Instantly regrets it. This entitled woman called security on a black passenger because she didn't think he belonged in first class. Then found out he's one of the highest-ranking medical officers in the U.S. military. The second-hand embarrassment is real. Hashtag karma is real. Hashtag racist. Karen. Hashtag instant justice. Hashtag Army General. Hashtag flight drama. Within minutes of posting the video to TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Simultaneously, Claire's phone began buzzing with notifications as likes, comments, and shares began pouring in at a rate that exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. The algorithm gods had clearly smiled upon her content, pushing it to broader and broader audiences as engagement rates skyrocketed beyond anything she had seen in her years of content creation. Meanwhile, several rows ahead, Vivian was completely unaware that her humiliation was being broadcast to millions of people around the world in real time. She sat hunched in her seat, staring blankly at the seatback screen in front of her, while trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred and what it might mean for her reputation and her business interests. Her phone, which she had set to silent during the confrontation, was now vibrating almost continuously with incoming notifications, but she was too traumatized and exhausted to check what was causing the constant stream of alerts. If she had looked, she would have seen that her company's stock price had already begun to fluctuate, as early reports of the incident began circulating on social media and financial news platforms. Isaiah, for his part, was trying to return his attention to the medical journal he had been reading before the entire ordeal began, but he found it difficult to concentrate knowing that he was now the subject of intense scrutiny from every other passenger in the first-class cabin. He had spent his entire career trying to maintain a low profile during his personal time, preferring to let his work speak for itself rather than seeking publicity or recognition for his service. The irony of the situation was not lost on him as he reflected on the fact that his attempt to travel quietly and anonymously had resulted in exactly the kind of public attention he had been hoping to avoid. He made a mental note to have a conversation with his security detail about travel protocols when he returned to Washington, knowing that this incident would likely be analyzed and discussed in briefings for months to come. Captain Martinez returned to the cockpit after ensuring that the cabin had returned to some semblance of normalcy. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the incident she had just witnessed was going to have repercussions that extended far beyond the confines of her aircraft. She had been flying for 3 decades and had never encountered a situation quite like this one, where a passenger's prejudice had collided so dramatically with military protocol and social media documentation. Back in the passenger cabin, Claire was monitoring the explosive growth of her video with a mixture of excitement and genuine concern about the broader implications of what she had captured. The comments section was already filled with thousands of responses ranging from outrage at Vivian's behavior to praise for Isaiah's dignity under pressure to calls for boycotts of whatever company Vivian might be associated with. "This is exactly why representation matters," read one comment that had already received hundreds of likes. "This man probably saves lives every day, but some people can't see past the color of his skin to recognize his humanity, let alone his service to our country." Another comment thread had already identified Vivian as the CEO of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals. Through facial recognition, software and public records searches, and users were beginning to share information about the company's government contracts and recent controversies involving product quality and safety standards. The Internet's collective investigative capabilities were now being brought to bear on someone who had never expected to become the subject of such intense scrutiny. Wait, isn't Blackwood Pharmaceuticals the company that had those contaminated medical supplies shipped to overseas bases last year? One user had written linking to news articles about product recalls and congressional investigations that Claire herself had never heard of, but that were apparently well-documented matters of public record. The connection between Vivian's company and military medical contracts was not lost on social media users who quickly began speculating about potential conflicts of interest and the broader implications of someone who displayed such obvious prejudice toward military personnel being involved in providing medical care to those same personnel overseas. Within 2 hours of Claire's initial post, #Blackwood Racism was trending on Twitter in the United States, and the video had been shared and reposted thousands of times across multiple platforms. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story, with CNN, NBC, and Fox News all running segments about the plain racism incident during their afternoon news cycles. The speed with which the story was spreading exceeded even Claire's considerable experience with viral content, and she found herself fielding interview requests from major media outlets who wanted to get first-hand accounts of what had transpired on the flight. She had inadvertently become the primary source for one of the biggest social media stories of the week, and the responsibility of that role was beginning to feel overwhelming. Dr. Washington, meanwhile, had finally managed to return his attention to his medical journal, though he remained acutely aware of the whispered conversations taking place around him as other passengers continued to process what they had witnessed. He had been through enough media cycles during his military career to know that this story would likely continue growing for several days before eventually being replaced by the next viral moment, and he was already mentally preparing for the inevitable requests for interviews and statements that would follow. The flight attendant Sarah approached his seat with a complimentary glass of champagne and a handwritten note from Captain Martinez, expressing her personal apologies for the incident and her gratitude for his service to the country. It was a small gesture, but one that Isaiah appreciated as evidence that not everyone on the aircraft shared Vivian Blackwood's narrow worldview. As the plane continued its journey toward London, the contrast between the two main participants in the drama could not have been more stark. Isaiah sat calmly reading about advances in trauma surgery, while occasionally checking messages from his daughter about her upcoming graduation, while Vivian remained hunched in her seat, completely unaware that her life was being systematically dismantled by the collective power of social media outrage and investigative journalism. The story was no longer just about a confrontation on an airplane between two passengers with different perspectives on appropriate behavior and social norms. It had evolved into a broader conversation about prejudice, privilege, accountability, and the intersection of personal behavior with professional responsibility, particularly when that professional responsibility involved life or death decisions affecting military personnel serving overseas. By the time the plane began its descent into London Heathrow Airport 6 hours later, Vivian Blackwood's name had become synonymous with entitled racism in the minds of millions of people around the world, while Dr. Isaiah Washington had inadvertently become a symbol of dignity and grace under pressure. Neither of them had any idea just how dramatically their lives were about to change as a result of a few minutes of conflict in Seat 2B of Flight 447. The financial markets had already begun responding to the viral video, even before Vivian became aware of her newfound internet infamy, as institutional investors and automated trading algorithms processed the potential implications of having a major military medical contractor led by someone who had just publicly displayed such obvious prejudice against the very population her company was supposed to serve. Blackwood Pharmaceutical's stock price, which had closed the previous day at $127.50 per share, began dropping steadily as soon as Asian markets opened and news of the incident began circulating through financial news networks and social media platforms. By the time European markets opened for business, the stock had fallen to $119.30, representing a 7% decline that wiped out nearly $2 billion in market capitalization in just a few hours. Marcus Thompson. Blackwood Pharmaceutical's chief financial officer was awakened at 3:47 a.m. Eastern Time by an urgent phone call from the company's overnight trading desk, alerting him to the precipitous drop in share price and the flood of social media content that appeared to be driving the sell-off. Marcus had been with the company for 12 years and had weathered his share of corporate crises, but he had never seen anything quite like the perfect storm of public relations disaster and market panic that was unfolding in real time. "Marcus, you need to see this video immediately," said Janet Liu, the head of overnight trading, her voice tight with concern as she walked him through the social media posts that were driving the market reaction. "It's everywhere, and it's not good. Vivian is being absolutely destroyed online, and people are calling for boycotts of all our products and cancellation of all our government contracts." Marcus pulled up the now viral video on his laptop, watching in horror as his CEO systematically destroyed her own reputation and potentially the company's future in less than 3 minutes of captured footage. He had known Vivian for over a decade and had always been aware of her tendency toward entitled behavior. But he had never imagined that she would display such obvious racism in such a public setting. The comment sections beneath the various social media posts were filled with calls for congressional investigations into Blackwood Pharmaceutical's government contracts, demands for immediate termination of all military medical supply agreements, and detailed discussions of the company's recent quality control issues that most investors had assumed were minor technical matters, rather than potential indicators of broader management problems. "Janet, I need you to call an emergency board meeting for 6 a.m., Marcus said, his mind racing as he tried to calculate the potential financial impact of what was unfolding. "And get our crisis communications firm on the phone immediately. We need to start damage control before the U.S. markets open, or this is going to be an absolute bloodbath." Meanwhile, 3 time zones away in his Pentagon office, General Patricia Reynolds was being briefed by her staff about the viral video featuring one of her most senior medical officers and the CEO of one of the Defense Department's largest pharmaceutical contractors. General Reynolds served as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel and had ultimate oversight responsibility for military medical supply contracts worth billions of dollars annually. "Ma'am, we're looking at a potential public relations nightmare with significant operational implications," Colonel Sarah Martinez explained as she walked General Reynolds through the timeline of events and the social media response that was already generating calls from congressional offices demanding explanations and accountability. General Reynolds studied the video footage with the careful attention of someone who understood that personnel decisions at her level could have far-reaching consequences for military readiness and public confidence in the defense establishment. She had worked closely with Dr. Washington on multiple occasions and had tremendous respect for his professionalism and dedication to military medical care. "Colonel, I want a full review of all Blackwood Pharmaceutical's contracts on my desk by noon today." General Reynolds ordered, her tone indicating that this was not a request but a direct command with immediate implications for the company's future relationship with the Department of Defense. "And I want recommendations for alternative suppliers for all critical medical supplies currently sourced through Blackwood operations." The speed with which military leadership was responding to the incident reflected not only the obvious public relations concerns, but also legitimate questions about whether a company led by someone who displayed such prejudice toward military personnel could be trusted to provide life-saving medical supplies to those same personnel in combat situations overseas. Back on the aircraft, which was now halfway across the Atlantic Ocean, Vivian finally worked up the courage to check her phone and discovered the full scope of the digital catastrophe that was unfolding around her. Her assistant had sent dozens of increasingly frantic messages about plummeting stock prices, board member phone calls, and media interview requests that were pouring into the corporate headquarters. The first message from her assistant, sent just 2 hours after takeoff, was relatively calm. "Vivian, there's a video circulating on social media from your flight. Please call me when you get this message so we can discuss response strategy." But the messages quickly escalated in urgency and panic as the situation spiraled out of control. "The stock is down 12% and falling. The board is demanding an emergency meeting. CNN just called requesting a statement about the incident." By the most recent message sent just 30 minutes earlier, her assistant sounded completely overwhelmed. "Vivian, I don't know how to handle this anymore. We're getting hundreds of calls from reporters, investors are pulling out, and someone leaked internal documents about the quality control issues to the Washington Post. You need to call the legal team immediately. Vivian felt her hands shaking as she scrolled through the avalanche of notifications on her social media accounts, seeing thousands of comments calling her every variation of racist and demanding her immediate resignation from any position involving military contracts. The video of her confrontation with Dr. Washington had been viewed over 8 million times across various platforms, and new versions were being posted constantly with increasingly creative and damning commentary. One particularly viral TikTok remix had set her most inflammatory statements to music, turning her racist accusations into a catchy song that was being shared by teenagers who had probably never heard of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, but were delighted to participate in the online destruction of someone who represented everything they despised about entitled privilege and systemic racism. The hashtag Blackwood boycott was trending worldwide, with users sharing information about every product manufactured by her company and encouraging healthcare providers to find alternative suppliers for everything from basic bandages to complex surgical equipment. The scope and coordination of the online response exceeded anything Vivian had ever imagined possible, and she began to understand that she was facing not just a temporary public relations problem, but a fundamental threat to her company's existence. Dr. Washington, observing Vivian's obvious distress from across the aisle, felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and concern as he watched the natural consequences of her actions play out in real time. He had seen enough military justice proceedings to understand that accountability was essential for maintaining order and standards, but he also recognized that the Internet's capacity for collective punishment could sometimes exceed what was proportional or constructive. His own phone was buzzing with messages from colleagues and family members who had seen the video and were offering support and expressing outrage on his behalf, but he had years of experience managing media attention and knew that the best response was usually to maintain dignity and let others speak on his behalf, rather than engaging directly in public controversy. A text message from his daughter Maya brought a smile to his face despite the chaos unfolding around him. "Dad, I just saw the video, and I'm so proud of how you handled that horrible woman. You showed more grace than she deserved, and I hope this incident helps people understand why representation in leadership positions matters so much. Love you." The contrast between Maya's supportive message and the torrent of abuse that Vivian was receiving on social media highlighted the different ways that personal choices and values could ripple outward to affect not just individual lives, but broader conversations about justice, accountability, and the kind of society people wanted to build together. As the plane continued its journey eastward over the dark Atlantic, the two main participants in the viral confrontation were processing very different realities. Dr. Washington was receiving messages of support and admiration from colleagues around the world, while Vivian was watching her personal and professional life disintegrate in real time as a direct consequence of her decision to judge another human being based on prejudice rather than character. The incident was already being analyzed by social media experts, business journalists, and civil rights organizations as a case study in how quickly and completely someone's life could change in the age of viral content and online accountability. What had begun as a routine confrontation between two passengers on an airplane had evolved into a broader conversation about power privilege, racism, and the consequences of treating other people as less deserving of basic human dignity. The London Heathrow Airport security office, where Vivian found herself 6 hours later, was a sterile, windowless room with fluorescent lighting that seemed designed to make everyone look guilty regardless of their actual innocence or culpability. She sat hunched in a plastic chair, her expensive Chanel suit wrinkled and her platinum hair disheveled, clutching her phone like a lifeline while trying to process the complete collapse of everything she had spent decades building. The UK Border Force officers who had detained her upon arrival were polite but firm in their questioning about the incident that had occurred in British airspace, and they had made it clear that her behavior on the aircraft could potentially constitute a violation of hate crime legislation that carried serious legal consequences, including possible imprisonment and permanent deportation bans. Miss Blackwood, we need to understand exactly what motivated your actions on Flight 447, said Inspector Davies, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent years dealing with the worst aspects of human behavior. The video footage suggests that you made assumptions about Dr. Washington based primarily on his race and appearance rather than any actual evidence of wrongdoing. Vivian stared at the table in front of her, unable to meet the inspector's eyes, as the weight of her actions finally began to sink in with devastating clarity. For the first time in hours, she wasn't thinking about stock prices or board meetings or damage control strategies, but simply about the human being she had treated with such cruelty and disrespect for no reason other than her own fear and prejudice. "I don't know why I did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the small room. "I saw him sitting there and I assumed things about him that weren't true. I was stressed about business meetings. I was afraid of losing control of my company, and I took all of that fear and anger out on someone who had done absolutely nothing wrong." The admission felt like poison, leaving her system painful but necessary as she confronted the ugly reality of her own behavior for the first time without the protective armor of wealth and status that had insulated her from consequences for so many years. She thought about her late husband, Richard, who had built Blackwood Pharmaceuticals on principles of service and integrity, and she wondered what he would think of what she had become in the years since his death. Inspector Davies studied Vivian's face with the clinical assessment of someone trained to distinguish between genuine remorse and performance art, noting the trembling in her hands and the tears that seemed to come from a place of authentic shame rather than self-pity. "Miss Blackwood, Doctor, Washington has declined to press charges for the harassment that occurred on the aircraft, but that doesn't eliminate the potential for other legal consequences related to your actions." The news that Dr. Washington had chosen not to pursue legal action hit Vivian like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the fact that the man she had tried to destroy with false accusations was showing her more mercy than she had shown him. The grace he was extending in the face of her cruelty felt almost unbearable, highlighting the profound moral bankruptcy of her own behavior in ways that no legal consequence could have achieved. A soft knock on the door interrupted the interview, and Inspector Davies looked up in surprise as Dr. Washington himself entered the room, still dressed in the same casual clothes that had so offended Vivian hours earlier. He had specifically requested permission to speak with her privately before continuing on to his hotel, citing his belief that restorative justice required direct communication between those who had caused harm and those who had suffered it. "General Washington." "This is highly unusual," Inspector Davies said, though her tone suggested respect for his decision, rather than opposition to it. "Are you certain you want to have this conversation without legal counsel present?" "I'm quite certain," Inspector Dr. Washington replied calmly. "Miss Blackwood and I need to have a conversation about what happened today. And I believe that conversation will be more productive if we can speak honestly without the adversarial structure of formal legal proceedings." Vivian looked up at Dr. Washington with a mixture of terror and shame, unable to comprehend why someone she had treated so badly would want to spend even another moment in her presence. She had expected him to pursue every possible legal remedy and public humiliation available to him, and his decision to seek direct dialogue instead left her feeling even more confused and ashamed about her own motivations and actions. "Dr. Washington, I'm so sorry," she began, her voice cracking with emotion as she struggled to find words adequate to express the depth of her regret. "I have no excuse for how I treated you. I was wrong about everything, and I caused you pain and embarrassment that you didn't deserve. I understand if you hate me and never want to see me again." Dr. Washington pulled up a chair across from her and sat down, his movements deliberate and calm as he studied her face with the same clinical attention he might bring to evaluating a patient's condition. "Miss Blackwood, I don't hate you," he said quietly, "but I need you to understand the impact of what you did today, not just on me personally, but on the broader conversation about how we treat each other as human beings." Vivian nodded frantically, desperate to show that she was listening and willing to learn from someone whose wisdom and experience she had been too blinded by prejudice to recognize just hours earlier. "I want to understand. I need to understand. I've spent my whole life thinking I was a good person, and today I discovered that I'm capable of treating another human being in ways that are absolutely inexcusable. The first step toward becoming a better person is recognizing the harm we've caused." Dr. Washington said, his tone carrying the patience of someone who had spent years helping people work through trauma and difficult truths. "But recognition without action is meaningless. The question is what you're going to do with this awareness now that you have it." For the next hour, Vivian found herself engaged in the most honest and difficult conversation of her adult life as Dr. Washington walked her through the broader implications of her behavior and the ways that prejudice and assumption could cause real harm to real people beyond the immediate targets of discriminatory treatment. He spoke about the military personnel who relied on quality medical supplies from companies like hers, and how leadership that was motivated by fear and prejudice could literally cost lives in ways that went far beyond corporate profits and stock prices. "Miss Blackwood, you have a choice to make," Dr. Washington said as their conversation drew to a close. "You can spend your energy trying to minimize the consequences of today and return to the same patterns of behavior that led to this moment, or you can use this crisis as an opportunity to become the person you were meant to be before fear and entitlement corrupted your judgment." Vivian wiped tears from her eyes as she processed the profound generosity of someone who was offering her a path toward redemption even after she had tried to destroy his reputation and dignity. "What would that look like?" she asked. "How do I even begin to make amends for something like this?" "It starts with telling the truth," Dr. Washington replied simply. "About what you did, why you did it, and what you're going to do differently going forward. And then it requires years of consistent action to prove that your words have meaning beyond just damage control." As Dr. Washington prepared to leave the security office and continue with his travel plans, Vivian felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. The conversation had stripped away all the protective layers of wealth and status that had allowed her to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about her own character, and for the first time in years, she was seeing herself clearly. "Dr. Washington," she called out as he reached the door, "thank you for giving me a chance to apologize in person. I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to earn it through my actions rather than my words." He nodded once, a gesture that contained both acknowledgement of her commitment and a clear understanding that redemption would require sustained effort over time, rather than momentary expressions of regret. As the door closed behind him, Vivian was left alone with the consequences of her choices and the daunting but necessary work of rebuilding herself from the ground up. The emergency board meeting at Blackwood Pharmaceutical's headquarters took place in the mahogany-paneled conference room where Vivian had presided over countless strategic decisions during her 5 years as CEO, but the atmosphere on this particular morning was unlike anything the company had experienced in its 60-year history. The stock price had continued its precipitous decline overnight, falling another 18% in after-hours trading as institutional investors fled from any association with the viral video and its implications for the company's government contracts. Board Chairman Robert Sterling called the meeting to order at exactly 6 a.m. Eastern Time, his normally cordial demeanor replaced by the grim efficiency of someone who understood that the company was facing an existential crisis that would require immediate and decisive action. The 12-member board represented decades of pharmaceutical industry experience and included former FDA officials, retired military medical officers, and seasoned business executives who had weathered previous corporate scandals. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we all understand why we're here. Sterling began gesturing toward the wall-mounted television screen that was currently displaying CNN's coverage of what they were calling flight racism scandal and its potential impact on military medical supply contracts. The footage speaks for itself, and the market reaction has been swift and severe. Chief Financial Officer Marcus Thompson presented a devastating financial analysis that quantified the immediate damage to the company's market position and projected the potential long-term consequences if current trends continued. We've lost nearly $4 billion in market capitalization in less than 24 hours. Marcus reported, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was describing. More concerning is the fact that we're receiving cancellation notices on civilian contracts, and our legal team expects formal notification of government contract suspensions within days. Board member Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a former Army Medical Corps colonel who had served multiple tours in Afghanistan, spoke with particular authority about the military implications of the crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, I've spent my career working with medical officers like Dr. Washington, and I can tell you that the defense establishment takes these issues extremely seriously. When a contractor's leadership displays the kind of prejudice we saw in that video, it raises fundamental questions about their commitment to serving all military personnel regardless of race or background. The discussion that followed was both tactical and philosophical, as board members grappled with the immediate crisis management requirements while also confronting deeper questions about corporate culture and leadership accountability. Several members noted that this incident had exposed underlying problems that extended beyond Vivian's personal behavior to include quality control issues and cost-cutting measures that had been generating internal concerns for months. The truth is that we've been cutting corners in ways that compromise product quality, admitted Chief Operating Officer David Chen, seizing the moment to address problems he had been trying to raise internally for over a year. The contaminated bandage incident last quarter, the delayed shipments to overseas bases, the increased rejection rates on surgical equipment. These aren't isolated quality control failures. They're the predictable result of prioritizing short-term profits over the standards our customers depend on for life and death situations. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in London, Vivian was sitting in her hotel room staring at her laptop screen as she watched her life's work being systematically dismantled by people who had once trusted her leadership and judgment. Her phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, lawyers, crisis communications specialists, and former friends who were either offering support or distancing themselves from the scandal depending on their own risk tolerance and moral calculations. The most difficult call came from her estranged daughter Emma, who lived in Seattle and had maintained minimal contact with her mother since a bitter argument about family values 3 years earlier. Emma had seen the viral video through her own social media feeds and was calling not to offer comfort, but to express her own shame and anger about being associated with such public displays of racism and cruelty. "Mom, I've spent years trying to explain to friends why I keep my distance from you, and now everyone can see exactly what I've been talking about," Emma said, her voice tight with a mixture of hurt and vindication. "You always told me I was being too sensitive about your comments and attitudes, but that video shows the world exactly who you really are when you think nobody important is watching." The conversation that followed was painful and necessary as Emma cataloged years of smaller incidents and casual prejudices that had gradually eroded their relationship, while Vivian had remained oblivious to the cumulative impact of her behavior on someone who had grown up watching her mother's treatment of service workers' employees and anyone she perceived as being beneath her social status. "Emma, I'm beginning to understand that this isn't just about what happened on the airplane. Vivian said, her voice hollow with the realization that the viral video had simply exposed patterns of behavior that had been damaging relationships and causing harm for years. "I've been a terrible person and an even worse mother, and I don't know how to fix any of it." The admission surprised both of them, as Vivian had never previously shown any capacity for the kind of honest self-reflection that might lead to genuine change. Emma found herself caught between her anger at years of dismissed concerns and a cautious hope that this crisis might finally provide the motivation for her mother to examine her own behavior with the seriousness it deserved. "Mom, the question isn't whether you can fix the past," Emma said carefully. "The question is whether you're willing to do the work necessary to become someone different going forward. And that work has to be about more than just protecting your business or your reputation. It has to be about genuinely understanding the harm you've caused and committing to never cause that kind of harm again." Back in the Blackwood Pharmaceuticals boardroom, the discussion had moved from crisis assessment to decisive action as board members voted unanimously to suspend Vivian from her CEO duties, pending a comprehensive investigation into both the immediate incident and broader concerns about corporate culture and product quality standards. "The board's decision is effective immediately," Chairman Sterling announced during a hastily arranged press conference that was broadcast live on financial news networks. Blackwood Pharmaceuticals was founded on principles of service and integrity, and we are committed to ensuring that our leadership reflects those values in both their professional and personal conduct. The announcement sent the stock price into another tailspin, but it also began the process of separating the company's long-term viability from Vivian's personal reputation and behavior. Industry analysts noted that the decisive action suggested a board that was prioritizing corporate survival over loyalty to individual executives, which could potentially provide a foundation for rebuilding trust with government and civilian customers. As news of her suspension reached Vivian in her London hotel room, she experienced a complex mixture of devastation and relief that surprised her with its intensity. The loss of her position felt like a death, the end of an identity that had defined her for decades, but it also removed the pressure to defend decisions and attitudes that she was beginning to recognize as fundamentally indefensible. For the first time since Richard's death 5 years earlier, Vivian found herself facing the possibility of defining herself as something other than the CEO of a pharmaceutical company or the widow of a successful businessman. The prospect was terrifying, but it was also oddly liberating, offering the possibility of becoming someone whose worth wasn't measured purely in terms of financial statements and corporate achievements. The congressional hearing room was packed with reporters, military family advocates, and pharmaceutical industry representatives when Vivian walked to the witness table 6 weeks after the airplane incident that had destroyed her career and forced her to confront the ugliest aspects of her own character. She had spent the intervening weeks in intensive therapy bias training and painful conversations with people who had experienced discrimination throughout their careers, gradually building an understanding of the harm caused not just by her dramatic public meltdown, but by years of smaller acts of prejudice and entitlement. The decision to testify voluntarily rather than fighting the subpoena had surprised her legal team, who had advised her to invoke Fifth Amendment protections and avoid any public statements that might be used against her in potential civil litigation. But Vivian had reached a point in her personal journey where legal strategy mattered less than the moral imperative to accept responsibility for the consequences of her actions and decisions. "Miss Blackwood, thank you for appearing before this committee," voluntarily said Congresswoman Maria Santos, the chairwoman of the House Oversight Subcommittee on Government Contracting. "We understand that you waived your right to counsel for this testimony, which is highly unusual in proceedings of this nature." Vivian adjusted the microphone in front of her, noting the irony that she was now sitting in the same type of witness chair where she had watched other corporate executives defend their company's failures during previous congressional investigations. Congresswoman Santos: "I'm here today because I believe accountability requires facing difficult questions honestly, even when the answers reflect poorly on my judgment and leadership. The first hour of questioning focused on the specific incident that had triggered the investigation as committee members walked through the timeline of events and explored the mindset that had led to Vivian's racist assumptions and aggressive behavior toward Dr. Washington. The video footage was played multiple times during the hearing, and each viewing forced Vivian to confront the ugliness of her own words and actions in the most public forum imaginable. Miss Blackwood, in your own words, can you explain what motivated your behavior toward Dr. Washington on that aircraft? Asked Congressman James Miller, a retired Marine Corps officer who had served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. What were you thinking when you decided that this decorated military medical officer didn't belong in first class? Vivian took a deep breath, knowing that this moment would define not just the hearing, but her entire effort to rebuild her life on a foundation of honesty, rather than defensiveness. Congressman Miller's sigh was thinking exactly what the video shows, that a black man in casual clothes couldn't possibly afford or deserve to be sitting in first class. I made assumptions based on racist stereotypes that I had carried for years without examining or challenging, and I acted on those assumptions in ways that were cruel and dehumanizing. The admission sent a ripple through the hearing room as observers had expected either defiance or carefully parsed legal language, rather than such direct acceptance of responsibility. Vivian's therapist had prepared her for this moment by explaining that genuine accountability required naming the harm caused rather than minimizing it through euphemisms or deflection. The questioning then shifted to broader issues of corporate leadership and product quality as committee members explored the connection between discriminatory attitudes and the cost-cutting decisions that had led to contaminated medical supplies being shipped to military bases overseas. The revelation that substandard bandages had caused infections in wounded soldiers while Vivian was focused on maximizing profits created a direct link between her personal prejudices and life-threatening consequences for the people her company was supposed to protect. Miss Blackwood, our investigation has revealed that your company saved approximately $12 million over 2 years by switching to cheaper materials and reduced quality control testing, said Congresswoman Santos, referencing internal documents that had been leaked during the media frenzy following the airplane incident. During that same period, we documented 17 separate incidents of product failures that resulted in medical complications for military personnel. How do you reconcile these facts with your company's mission to support military medical care? The question forced Vivian to confront the most painful aspect of her leadership failures: the realization that her fear-driven decision-making and prejudiced assumptions hadn't just hurt Dr. Washington during a single airplane flight, but had created a pattern of corner-cutting and negligence that had put soldiers' lives at risk thousands of miles away from any congressional hearing room. Congresswoman, I can't reconcile those facts because they're irreconcilable, Vivian said, her voice breaking slightly as the full weight of the consequences began to sink in. I allowed my fear of losing control and my prejudiced assumptions about who deserved respect and consideration to cloud my judgment about basic safety and quality standards. Soldiers were injured because I prioritized short-term profits over the lives of people who depend on our products in life-or-death situations, Dr. Washington himself testified later in the hearing, providing expert context about military medical supply standards and the real-world impact of quality control failures on combat operations. His testimony was measured and professional, focusing on process improvements and accountability mechanisms rather than personal grievances or demands for punishment. Dr. Washington, what would you like to see come out of this investigation in terms of preventing similar problems in the future? Asked Congressman Miller, clearly seeking recommendations from someone whose expertise and credibility were unquestioned. Congressman, I believe this incident highlights the need for more rigorous oversight of contractor leadership, including bias training and cultural competency requirements for anyone involved in military support operations, Dr. Washington replied. When people in positions of authority carry unconscious prejudices, those prejudices can influence decision-making in ways that compromise mission effectiveness and endanger lives. The hearing concluded with Vivian's commitment to support new industry standards for leadership accountability and bias prevention, including her agreement to fund sensitivity training programs for pharmaceutical executives and quality assurance personnel. The financial penalty was significant, over $50 million in training and monitoring costs, but it represented her first concrete step toward using her remaining wealth to address the problems her leadership had created. 6 months after the hearing, Vivian found herself in an unexpected place volunteering at the Washington, D.C. Veterans Medical Center, working directly with patients who had been affected by the very quality control failures her company had allowed to occur. The work was humbling and often heartbreaking as she met soldiers who had experienced complications from contaminated medical supplies and who were now struggling with disabilities that might have been prevented by better corporate leadership. Mrs. Blackwood, "Could you help me change this dressing?" asked Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a young veteran who had lost his right leg to an IED in Syria and was now dealing with persistent infections that had been exacerbated by contaminated bandages from her former company. He had no idea who she was or the role she had played in his medical complications, and she had made the decision not to burden him with that knowledge. The irony of the situation was not lost on Vivian as she carefully helped change the bandages on wounds that her own company's negligence had made worse. The work was physically and emotionally demanding, requiring patience, attention to detail, and genuine care for people who had sacrificed their health in service to their country. It was exactly the opposite of the abstract, profit-focused leadership she had exercised from boardrooms and executive suites. Each day at the medical center brought new opportunities to understand the human cost of the decisions she had made as CEO, and gradually she began to develop the empathy and perspective that had been missing from her previous approach to leadership and life. The transformation was neither quick nor easy, but it was authentic in ways that her previous success had never been. The Johns Hopkins Medical School graduation ceremony took place on a brilliantly sunny May morning, exactly 1 year after the airplane incident that had changed so many lives in ways that none of the participants could have anticipated. Dr. Maya Washington stood with her fellow graduates in the traditional academic regalia, her face glowing with pride and accomplishment as she prepared to receive the medical degree that represented 4 years of intensive study and countless hours of clinical training. In the audience, Dr. Isaiah Washington watched his daughter with the fierce pride that comes from seeing a child achieve something that represents not just personal success, but the fulfillment of dreams that had been nurtured through years of encouragement, sacrifice, and unwavering support. Maya had decided to specialize in emergency medicine, drawn to the fast-paced environment, where quick thinking and clinical skill could mean the difference between life and death for patients in crisis. What made this graduation particularly meaningful was the presence of an unexpected guest in the audience. Vivian Blackwood, who had specifically requested permission to attend after learning about Maya's graduation through her work at the Veterans Medical Center. The request had surprised both Dr. Washington and Maya, but after considerable discussion, they had agreed that Vivian's presence might represent an important step in everyone's journey toward understanding and healing. Vivian sat several rows behind the Washington family, dressed simply in a navy blue dress that was elegant but understated a marked contrast to the designer outfits and conspicuous displays of wealth that had once defined her public image. The past year had transformed her in ways that went far beyond appearance as the daily work of caring for wounded veterans had gradually stripped away the entitlement and prejudice that had driven her behavior for so many years. The transformation hadn't been easy or automatic, and there had been many moments during the past 12 months when Vivian had wanted to retreat back to the comfortable isolation of wealth and status, rather than continuing the difficult work of examining her own biases and assumptions. But the faces of the veterans she worked with every day had provided constant reminders of the real-world consequences of leadership failures and the importance of approaching other people with humility rather than judgment. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome this year's recipient of the Frederick Douglass Award for Medical Excellence and Social Justice. Dr. Maya Washington announced the Dean of the Medical School as Maya stepped forward to receive an honor that recognized not just academic achievement, but commitment to addressing healthcare disparities and serving underrepresented communities. Maya's acceptance speech was brief but powerful, focusing on the responsibility that comes with medical training and the importance of treating every patient with dignity regardless of their background, insurance status, or social position. Medicine is fundamentally about recognizing the humanity in every person who comes to us for help, she said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. We have the privilege of healing, but that privilege comes with the obligation to see beyond surface appearances to the shared human experience that connects us all. The words resonated deeply with Vivian, who recognized in Maya's speech the same wisdom and grace that Dr. Washington had shown during their difficult conversation in the London security office. The Washington family had somehow managed to transform a moment of ugliness and prejudice into an opportunity for education and growth, demonstrating the kind of moral leadership that Vivian was still learning to emulate. After the ceremony, Dr. Washington approached Vivian with Maya at his side, the three of them standing together in what would have been an unimaginable scene just 1 year earlier. The conversation that followed was awkward at first as all three participants navigated the complex emotions and history that connected them, but gradually it evolved into something more genuine and hopeful. Dr. Washington, Maya, I want you both to know how grateful I am for the opportunity to be here today, Vivian said, her voice carrying the authentic humility that had replaced her previous arrogance. Watching Maya receive that award and hearing her speak about the responsibility that comes with healing has reminded me of why I originally wanted to get involved in pharmaceutical work, to help people rather than just to make money. Maya studied Vivian's face with the clinical attention she had learned to bring to patient assessment, noting the absence of the entitled aggression that had been so prominent in the viral video. Mrs. Blackwood, my father told me about the work you've been doing at the Veterans Medical Center. Sergeant Rodriguez mentioned that you've been helping with his physical therapy, though he doesn't know about your connection to his case. The mention of Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the soldiers who had been affected by contaminated medical supplies from Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, created a moment of profound connection as all three participants acknowledged the complex web of cause and effect that had brought them together. Vivian's face showed genuine pain as she was reminded of the real-world consequences of her leadership failures. Working with Mike and the other veterans has been the most meaningful thing I've ever done, Vivian said quietly. It's also been the most difficult because every day I see people who were hurt by decisions I made from a corporate boardroom without thinking about the human impact. I can never undo that harm, but I can spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends through service rather than just words. Dr. Washington nodded appreciatively, recognizing the authenticity in Vivian's transformation while maintaining appropriate boundaries about forgiveness and trust. Mrs. Blackwood, change is possible for anyone who's willing to do the work, but that work has to be sustained over time rather than just performed for public relations purposes. What you've been doing at the medical center suggests that you're serious about becoming someone different. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a documentary film crew that had been following the aftermath of the airplane incident for several months, creating a comprehensive examination of how viral moments can either destroy lives or catalyze meaningful change depending on how people choose to respond to public accountability. The documentary, tentatively titled Seat 2BA Story of Accountability and Redemption, had been following both Dr. Washington and Vivian through their respective journeys over the past year, capturing the complex process of healing that had emerged from what initially seemed like a simple story of racism and consequences. Dr. Washington, Mrs. Blackwood, would you be willing to participate in a joint interview about what you've both learned from this experience? Asked the documentary director, a young filmmaker who had been struck by the unusual trajectory of the story and its potential to contribute to broader conversations about justice, forgiveness, and personal transformation. Both participants agreed to the interview, which took place in a quiet corner of the medical school campus, with Maya serving as an informal moderator who could speak to the broader implications of their journey. The conversation that followed was honest and sometimes uncomfortable, as both Dr. Washington and Vivian reflected on the events that had brought them together and the lessons they had learned about prejudice, privilege, and the possibility of genuine change. Mrs. Blackwood, what do you want people to understand about the person you were a year ago versus the person you're trying to become now? Asked the interviewer, seeking to capture the essence of personal transformation that had emerged from such an ugly beginning. Vivian considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would likely be seen by millions of people and would represent her most public statement about the journey she had undertaken. A year ago, I was someone who used wealth and status to avoid examining uncomfortable truths about my own behavior and its impact on other people. Today, I'm someone who's learning that real worth comes from service rather than success, and that treating other people with dignity is the most basic requirement of being human. 2 years after the incident that had sparked a national conversation about prejudice, privilege, and accountability, the ripple effects continued to spread through institutions and communities in ways that no one could have predicted when Claire Dubois first posted her viral video from Seat 4A. The Blackwood Foundation for Military Medical Excellence, established with Vivian's remaining personal wealth after the dissolution of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, had become a leading force in promoting quality standards and bias prevention training throughout the defense contracting industry. The foundation's work was overseen by a board that included Dr. Washington, several other senior military medical officers, and veterans who had been affected by quality control failures in medical supply chains. The goal isn't to punish people for past mistakes, Dr. Washington explained during a foundation board meeting in the organization's modest Washington, D.C. offices. The goal is to create accountability structures that prevent those mistakes from happening in the future and ensure that people in leadership positions understand the real-world consequences of their decisions. Vivian, who now served as a program coordinator rather than holding any executive authority, had spent the past year developing bias prevention curricula that were being implemented by defense contractors around the world. The work was demanding and often emotionally difficult, as it required her to constantly confront her own past failures while helping other leaders recognize and address similar blind spots in their own thinking. The most meaningful aspect of her new role was the direct feedback she received from military personnel who participated in the Foundation's training programs and who often shared their own experiences with discrimination and prejudice in professional settings. These conversations had given Vivian a deep understanding of how casual racism and bias could affect people's career trajectories, personal well-being, and ability to serve effectively in high-stress environments. Mrs. Blackwood, I have to tell you that when I first heard you were involved with this foundation, I was skeptical about whether someone who had displayed such obvious prejudice could genuinely change, said Lieutenant Colonel Ashley Thompson, a nurse practitioner who had experienced discrimination throughout her military career and was now participating in the Foundation's leadership development program. The comment stung, but Vivian had learned to accept such feedback as both fair and necessary for maintaining accountability in her new role. Colonel Thompson, your skepticism is completely justified based on my past behavior. I hope that over time my actions will demonstrate that change is possible, but I understand that trust has to be earned through consistent behavior rather than just good intentions. The conversation took place during a Foundation conference that brought together military medical professionals, defense contractors, and civil rights advocates to discuss best practices for preventing discrimination and ensuring quality standards in military support operations. The annual event had become a respected forum for addressing difficult issues that were often avoided in more formal military and corporate settings. Dr. Washington, who had been promoted to Surgeon General 6 months after the airplane incident, used his platform to advocate for comprehensive reforms in military medical supply chains and leadership accountability standards. His approach was characteristically measured and professional, focusing on policy improvements rather than personal grievances. But his moral authority on these issues had been significantly enhanced by the viral video and its aftermath. Change happens when people are willing to examine uncomfortable truths about themselves and their institutions, Dr. Washington said during his keynote address at the Foundation conference. The incident that brought many of us together demonstrated how quickly prejudice and poor judgment can escalate into serious consequences, but it also showed that people are capable of learning and growing when they're held accountable for their actions. Maya Washington now. Dr. Maya Washington, and working as an emergency medicine resident at Walter Reed Medical Center, often spoke at Foundation events about the importance of representation in leadership positions and the ways that bias could affect patient care in clinical settings. Her perspective as both the daughter of a senior military officer and a young physician provided unique insights into the intersection of personal experience and professional responsibility. When my father was harassed on that airplane, it wasn't just an attack on him personally, Maya explained during a panel discussion about discrimination in healthcare settings. It was an attack on the idea that Black professionals deserve the same respect and consideration as their white colleagues, regardless of how they're dressed or where they're sitting. Those attitudes don't disappear when people walk into hospitals or operating rooms. The Foundation's work had also attracted attention from business schools and leadership development programs, which began incorporating case studies about the Blackwood incident into their curricula as examples of how corporate culture and personal bias could interact to create both ethical failures and opportunities for meaningful change. Professor Jennifer Chang at Harvard Business School had developed an entire semester-long course around the case study, exploring the intersection of corporate governance, social media, accountability, and personal transformation. This case is remarkable because it shows both the destructive potential of unchecked privilege and bias and the constructive potential of genuine accountability and sustained efforts to change. Professor Chang explained to her students during a class session that included a video call with both Dr. Washington and Vivian. The students' questions during these virtual discussions often focused on the personal aspects of transformation rather than the business implications, seeking to understand how someone could fundamentally change their worldview and behavior patterns after decades of entrenched thinking. Mrs. Blackwood, what was the turning point for you in recognizing that you needed to change not just your public behavior, but your entire approach to thinking about other people? Asked one student whose own background as a first-generation college student had given him personal insight into the effects of prejudice and assumption. Vivian reflected on the question, understanding that her answer would influence how future leaders thought about accountability and personal growth. The turning point was realizing that my prejudices weren't just hurting other people. They were preventing me from seeing reality clearly and making good decisions. When you judge people based on stereotypes rather than evidence, you miss opportunities to learn from their expertise and experience. Dr. Washington had knowledge and perspective that could have helped my company serve military personnel more effectively, but I was too blinded by prejudice to recognize what he had to offer. As the third anniversary of the airplane incident approached, both Dr. Washington and Vivian found themselves reflecting on the unexpected trajectory their lives had taken since that confrontational morning in Seat 2B. The viral video continued to circulate on social media platforms, serving as a teaching tool in diversity training programs, and a reminder that individual moments of choice could have far-reaching consequences for entire communities. The story had evolved from a simple narrative of racism and punishment into something more complex and hopeful. A demonstration that accountability could lead to genuine transformation when people were willing to do the difficult work of examining their own behavior and committing to sustained change. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and it didn't erase the harm that had been caused, but it offered evidence that even the most damaged relationships and institutions could be rebuilt on foundations of honesty, service, and mutual respect. The legacy they were building together wasn't about forgiveness or redemption in any simple sense, but about the possibility of using painful experiences as catalysts for creating systems and relationships that were more just and equitable for everyone involved. It was work that would continue long after the viral video was forgotten, carried forward by the people whose lives had been changed by witnessing both the worst and best aspects of human nature within the confines of an airplane cabin at 30,000 feet. 3 years after Flight 447 touched down at London Heathrow, the Seat 2B incident had become a cornerstone case study in business ethics programs, military leadership academies, and social justice organizations worldwide. What began as a moment of cruelty had transformed into a powerful example of how accountability and sustained commitment could create meaningful change across entire industries and communities. Dr. Isaiah Washington continued his service as Surgeon General, while Maya completed her emergency medicine residency, their family's grace under pressure, serving as an ongoing reminder that dignity and principle could triumph over prejudice when supported by authentic institutional change. Vivian Blackwood had found purpose she never knew she was seeking in her work with wounded veterans, discovering that true fulfillment came not from accumulating wealth, but from using her remaining resources to heal the wounds her previous leadership had caused. The documentary Seat 2B won multiple awards and sparked conversations in communities around the globe, proving that individual moments of moral choice could ripple outward to touch millions of lives. In a world that often seemed divided by fear and misunderstanding, the unlikely partnership between a decorated general and a reformed pharmaceutical executive offered hope that even the most profound differences could be bridged through honest dialogue. Sustained accountability, and the recognition that everyone deserves to be treated with basic human dignity, regardless of how they look or where they choose to sit. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts about how conversations across difference have changed your own perspective. Together, we can build bridges of understanding, one dialogue at a time.